Today we're talking about another Avatar The Last Airbending episode, The Deserter, featuring the character Zhang the Deserter, who's a very interesting character as far as minor characters in this show go. The premise of the episode being that while doing their traveling thing, the gang come upon a Fire Nation colony town, I'm assuming, that's going to be holding a fire festival soon, where there's going to be showcases of firebending. And Aang does need to learn firebending at some point, which is problematic, because the Fire Nation are the bad guys. He's not going to be able to just roll into the Fire Nation and find a master to teach him like he expects to be able to roll into the North Pole. So he wants to observe some real firebending, so he can start to get a handle on how to do it. And even though Sokka thinks it's a bad idea to go into town since there's literal wanted posters of them posted outside, Katara and Aang overrule him. And it makes sense. It's one of those episodes where everybody kind of has a point. Like, I get Sokka wanting to be cautious. It makes sense to be cautious. They're 3 people taking on an entire country. But at the same time, Aang is right. To become a fully realized Avatar, he is going to have to learn firebending at some point. And even though this would be learning it out of order, does he really have a choice? Except to go out of order of the Avatar cycle if it's the only way to ever learn? And this is a question that comes up again after taking a stunt way too seriously. He reveals himself to be the Avatar despite being in disguise by airbending, and is whisked away, along with Sokka and Katara, by a Fire Nation army deserter who knows Zhang, the very first person to ever desert from the Fire Nation army and live. He's an elderly firebending master who many think is insane because he says a lot of cryptic stuff, but really he's just extremely wise, but like really forceful about it. So he just spouts all these wisdomous platitudes and hammers them into your head until they sink in. Essentially, he uses a lot of really cool, flowery metaphors. In fact, I'd recommend going and looking up his dialogue and just reading through it if you haven't seen the episode and don't really intend to, because it's pretty fun stuff. Like, it's pretty well written stuff. It sounds like nonsense at first, but especially in context, when you think about it a little longer, he actually has a fair few good points. And he knows that Aang isn't ready for firebending yet. He can just kind of tell from the way Aang carries himself that he hasn't learned the other elements yet. And this is where we get our first inkling that learning the elements in the order of the Avatar cycle actually has a purpose, as it seems that different types of avatars have to learn different types of things before they can learn certain elements. And Aang, without the discipline of learning the other elements first, just isn't ready to learn firebending. And he proves that when he's so impatient that after Roku channels himself through Aang and convinces Zhang to teach Aang, since Roku agrees that this might be Aang's only chance, Aang takes Zhang's lessons and goes too far with them, kind of like he might with a waterbending thing. But as Zhang tried to explain to him, fire is just inherently damaging. And so Aang loses control of it, and instead of just splashing somebody with some water, he burns Katara's hands pretty badly. She runs off crying. And even though this does lead to her dipping them in the river to soothe them and learning that she has the ability to heal through her waterbending, that doesn't excuse what he did. And like, yeah, Katara learns this skill and then forgives Aang because she's Katara and he's Aang, but also in part because of that. But like, he probably didn't really deserve her forgiveness that quickly, right? And it's so interesting because Zhang goes and speaks to Katara as she's healing herself, and he talks about how water brings life and fire only brings death. And he talks throughout the entire episode about how being a firebender is a burden. You're the steward of this thing, it becomes your responsibility to control it, to rein it in, to prevent it from harming people. And you could tell it was probably something along the lines of, like, if you've seen Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood or read the manga, there's a character in that who used his fire to do a lot of terrible stuff during a war. You kind of get the sense Zhang is kind of that same kind of character. He saw so much destruction come about because of fire, because of his fire. And I would assume he would count the fire of his students in with his fire. That it broke him and changed him fundamentally. Because we find out that his best student, his primary student, was Admiral Zhao. Someone who wasn't concerned with being the steward to that fire and just wanted to learn how to use it to destroy people. And you can tell that he's worried that even if Aang never reaches that point, if he isn't careful, if he doesn't learn the self-control that Zhao never learned, being the Avatar, and being a particularly powerful Avatar anyway, like there's been entire video essays on how powerful Aang is, even compared to most other Avatars, that he could cause real damage. And so every single one of the lessons that Zhang puts him through is about self-control. And even though it doesn't sink in time to prevent Aang from injuring Katara, by the end, when Zhao leads a raiding party up the river, having been informed that the Avatar is somewhere nearby and working out that that's where he would be, when he and Aang battle, Aang is able to beat him without attacking him even once, by using his lack of self-control against him, tricking him into burning all of his riverboats, stranding him there. Aang and his party are able to leave unabated, and unfortunately Zhang is not unfortunate that he gets away, but it's unfortunate that he gets away, because now Aang can't go to him for more lessons even once he's ready, because he doesn't know where he is. It's such an interesting episode, because Zhang and his lessons in self-control and the wisdom that Aang learned from him, they come into the story, whether directly or just kind of, as an aspect of Aang's arc that we can observe stuck with him later on in the show. But, it really felt like it was implied at this point in the story that Zhang was the person to teach Aang. In fact, I even think they mention him again when they're trying to think of who could teach Aang firebending. And it ends up being somebody else. So, on one hand, Zhang is a red herring. But Zhang is such an interesting example of something this show does really, really fantastically. And that's presents the Fire Nation people, the default villains of the show, as people. Like, the soldiers are usually treated more like stormtroopers, for example. People who do what they're told and present a clear obstacle for our heroes. But the rest of the people of the Fire Nation, they're just people. They're heavily propagandized people who believe that their nation is doing what it's doing for the best. In fact, at the festival thing, we actually see a little puppet show being put on that's literally just Fire Nation propaganda. It was such a cool detail to stick in there in an episode where we see someone who managed to escape from that propaganda system. Now here's Zhang, somebody who, power-wise, he's up there with some of the strongest firebenders in this show, and he's one of those people who is just a person. He's not a bad guy. He's not really even a good guy, because he kind of wants to just go off by himself and not firebend so he doesn't hurt people. But he's just a guy. There's so much nuance to him, and through him, it adds more nuance to the Fire Nation itself. I also really I noticed something here. He keeps talking about how being a firebender is a burden, and I think he takes it a little too far in that direction. Even firebending, as inherently damaging as it is really cool and has a lot of practical and positive uses. But he talks about having to carry that burden And that speaks to the fact that the Fire Nation, once this is all over, is going to have to carry the burden of rebuilding what they destroyed. And the fact that he has sought wisdom outside of the propaganda of the Fire Nation tells us that the Fire Nation is going to have to become a wiser nation once all this is over. He even seems to be someone who has taken the principles of other bending disciplines and learned from them, as he knows a lot about waterbending and what it can do, and he recognizes healing and all of that, which is not an unprecedented thing. We find out that Iroh is like this too, which speaks to the fact that the nations are going to have to come together and lift each other up after all this is over, and that the Fire Nation could learn a lot from the others rather than trying to oppress them. It's just his whole attitude, the kind of person he is. Even if I feel like he's too negative about fire and firebending, like unreasonably so, because his opinions on it have been colored by his own experiences, he really does seem like kind of the early archetype for the kind of modern firebender, or even Fire Nation person in general, who will exist once all this is over and the world has started to heal. Who will need to exist once all this is over and the world has started to heal, in order for things to get better. There's not much more to this one. The fight between Aang and Zhao is really cool, and it does further the plot. Like, I can't think of any examples off the top of my head right now, but I know for a fact that Aang feels like a wiser, more careful person after this. This does contribute to his arc. But overall, it's just a really good, solid episode on its own, that stands alone on its own. It has some pretty cool philosophical stuff in it too, and some decent world building. I like it a lot. As per usual though, guys, what did you think of the Avatar The Last Airbender episode, The Deserter? If you have seen it, let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, you might as well like the video, share it with anyone else who you think would enjoy my content, subscribe if you haven't. You can also check out links to my various social medias, as well as the many ways you can help out the channel. Those will be in the video description, but either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.